November elections. And on December 1st, we have Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist and author Tom Friedman for an evening event. And including our travel and education programs, the Council offers a robust schedule of tours and activities for our members, teachers, and students. Please pick up the literature that's available on the table near the elevators on your way out. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Edward Trzanski is the FPRI Templeton Fellow and co-chair of its Center for the Study of Terrorism, and a senior scholar with the American Institute for History Education, and of course, a board member, scholar in residence, and longtime friend of the World Affairs Council. Please join me in welcoming Ed Trzanski.
Denise, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. It's great to have you at one of these occasional salons that the council does. And I was saying to some people who had arrived earlier, council always manages to find the right topic that resonates with the news. And someone once said to me, well, they're lucky. On that point, I'm with Branch Rickey. Some people look like they might recognize him. Branch Rickey once said, luck is the residue of design. So it's not so much that we're lucky, we're good, and we put ourselves in a position to be good. And that's why today we're very pleased to bring you someone whose background and current duties really do fit into the context of what's being discussed most frequently around national security issues. Justin Sieberell is the acting coordinator for counterterrorism for the United States Department of State. He's been in that role roughly since February, but he has a very long resume of duty and accomplishment that put him in that position. If somebody said to you, how do you get there? Well, here's one way. You can be the principal officer in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. You can have assignments at U.S. embassies and consulates in Baghdad, Iraq, Amman, Jordan, Alexandria, Egypt, Panama City, Panama. And you can complete tours in the State Department's Operations Center and Executive Secretariat. And you can be a desk officer for Iran in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Mr. Sieberell did all that. He was also executive assistant to the National Security Advisor at the White House. Without further ado, please let's welcome Justin Sieberell. I'll take my notes. Excuse me.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. It's a very nice opportunity for me to be with you. Just a short train ride away, as we found out. I was momentarily panicked when the Amtrak signs said slight delay, then a 10-minute delay, then a 20-minute delay. But it stopped at 20 minutes, so we were on the train and up here. It's a very pleasant trip, so thank you again for the opportunity to be with you. I wanted to first also acknowledge the terrific work that's done here at the Philadelphia World Affairs Council. The education programs that you're involved in, the travel programs that you carry out to help bring the world to Americans and bring Americans to the world. And then also, of course, your speaker programs where you have an opportunity to bring in individuals perhaps to help you think through some of the issues confronting our country and our society as we navigate, an incredibly complex and changing global landscape.
Could you speak a little closer to the mic?
Yeah, can you hear me?
That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. I've had just a brief opportunity to hear a bit more about some of the student programs you have, and I'm very glad to see the students we have in the back of the room today. Thank you for coming, and I hope this piques your interest. It doesn't repel you from interest in a career in foreign affairs. I'll do my best to hold up my end of that bargain. I'll do my best to do so. My own background includes, when I first moved to Washington, my first job before joining the Foreign Service was working with an organization called Meridian House. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's an organization in Washington. It's a non-governmental organization that works closely with U.S. government, and in particular the U.S. Information Agency, in particular in the planning the International Visitor Leadership Program, the IVLP, which is a program that our government administers to invite emerging foreign leaders, leaders from around the world, to become acquainted with the United States. And we were involved in sending those individuals all around the United States and worked very frequently with World Affairs Councils everywhere from the big cities to the small towns. And it's just an amazing network, of Americans who are committed to understanding the world that we live in, and committed also to helping others understand who we are as Americans. So I salute you for your interest in foreign affairs, in national security, and for being involved. I think it's absolutely vital, especially as we, as I said, navigate a very complex and changing world. What I want to discuss with you today, and I'll keep my remarks fairly brief, is to give you some picture of how we view the current terrorism landscape, some of the trends we're seeing in this area, and some of the ways the international community is gathering to respond to it. And then also what then we as a government are doing about that, and specifically the role of diplomacy in our counterterrorism effort across the U.S. government. And then finally, maybe we'll end up with a few questions to pose about what we may look for in the future and some of the changes that we see emerging. So first, starting with the sort of the threat landscape, we've just released what is called our Country Reports on Terrorism. This is an annual report required by the Congress in which we detail, and are required to do so, terrorism trends globally. And that's a chapter-by-chapter look by country of the terrorism picture. And in addition, we release a statistical annex that records the total number of terrorist attacks around the world. And while statistics are not a terrific way to measure trends in terrorism, there may be just a couple that may be of interest to you that just came out. These statistics are put together by the University of Maryland. It's called the START Center, which is a think tank that has established a certain credibility in the sort of the academic world in the study of terrorism trends. And this annex is available at the State Department website if you'd like to read through it. It has some actually quite interesting details. What we found in the statistical annex this year was a total number of attacks in 2015 decreased slightly, 13% from 2014. Total fatalities decreased 14%, but principally because of fewer attacks in a few key countries around the world, in Iraq, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And that represents the first, although a slight decline, the first decline we've seen in fatalities and attacks since 2012. At the same time, in 2015, we saw increased attacks, terrorist attacks, in several countries that are, of course, very important to us and where we are working closely with host governments, and those include Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey, where we saw increases. And in Turkey, of course, you'll remember that there was basically a flare-up in violence between the government and the PKK, in which it had been involved in negotiations for a number of years. Those broke down in 2015, so a large spike in attacks in Turkey. In Bangladesh, you've seen some of these horrific attacks against individuals, some of them involved in the blogger movement, some involved in a secular movement that have been attacked, and they've seen, tragically, a number of increases in that country. And while attacks took place in 92 countries around the world, they were heavily concentrated, as they have been historically, in a number of countries. More than 55% of all attacks took place in only 5 countries. Those were Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nigeria. And 74% of all deaths from terrorist attacks took place in 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, and Pakistan. Now, like I said, statistics are not a terrific way to understand the full terrorism landscape, but these statistics at least do demonstrate that overwhelmingly the victims of terrorism are those from within those countries, Muslims in particular. So the terrorism that we see emanating out of the region is, in the first instance, overwhelmingly aimed at the people in those societies and those countries. So as we work with our partners, we do so in an environment in which many of their citizens are facing a really, really difficult situation. So in 2015, we also identified that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, ISIL, or known Daesh, was the most significant terrorist threat. That's no surprise. But 2015 was not a terrific year for ISIL. In fact, their territorial control in Iraq peaked in the spring. And also in Syria, they suffered significant losses of territory across the north of Syria in particular. Right now, you have local Syrian forces fighting to retake a city called Manbij in Syria, a very, very important logistics hub west of the Euphrates River. There's an important battle ongoing there. And of course, Fallujah, which was the first big city to fall to the Islamic State back in 2014, is under siege currently by Iraqi forces. So 2015 really saw the peak of territorial control of ISIL, and they've been sort of declining ever since. And that means also that the group has less access to finance. It has a harder time recruiting fighters into the what they call the caliphate, and they've suffered sort of consequently across a number of different. They've suffered across the organization in quite significant ways. If you think of 2014 was a really terrible year in which ISIL really broke out and kind of stormed the world, frankly, and shocked the world. 2015 was a year marked by the international community kind of finally coming together to confront it, and sort of slowly and grindingly made progress. And that progress continues into 2016. These are very, very hard battles and very, very difficult fight. But the trend lines are definitely toward ISIL losing further territory in Iraq and Syria. Now, there are consequences to that, and I'll go into that. Namely, that ISIL, in order to preserve a narrative of victory, will need to conduct attacks outside of that core area, in places like Paris, in places like Brussels, and to inspire attacks through propaganda, through recruitment, through the internet, even in places like the United States. So there are consequences to that essential progress that was made for 2015. But all the same, there is a trend line that is positive from that perspective. Now, its loss of territory has been the result of the efforts of local forces, Iraqi forces, Syrian Kurdish forces, in coordination with coalition countries and coalition airstrikes, which have targeted concentrations of fighters, important infrastructure, the oil and gas production sites, media facilities that have also put pressure upon the group. And importantly, one important metric or way to look at the strength of the organization is in its ability to attract individuals from around the world, what they call the foreign terrorist fighter cadre, that has been estimated by our intelligence community to have exceeded over 40,000 people from outside the conflict have moved into the area to fight alongside ISIL and then some of the other extremist groups that have taken advantage of the chaos and the conflict in Syria in particular. 40,000 individuals from over 100 different countries, including the United States, by the way, have collected and coalesced in that conflict. We've seen those numbers, however, drop, and the trend line there is also downward. That's a combination of a number of factors. Governments have taken important steps to strengthen their border controls, make it harder for people to access the conflict. Turkey, in particular, a country that was really the gateway for these people to arrive in Syria, has taken important steps in response to this problem. And then the conditions inside the country are obviously much less desirable and much less attractive, frankly, for people to try to access. Also, governments have been taking action against recruitment cells and facilitation networks that have helped these individuals get to Syria and Iraq. So that's one of the factors also we've seen. It's a very important one, but we still have a large collection of people that remain there from other countries with passports that would enable them to travel back to their home countries. So one of the principal efforts we're involved in really is to strengthen our capability with other governments, partner governments, to ensure people are not able to return back to their home countries. So while the main effort against Islamic State has been in Syria and Iraq, they have made, and there's been progress, as I said, they've also taken advantage of existing extremist organizations and movements outside of that area and identified with those groups, affiliated with those groups, and in that way expanded the reach of the organization. So importantly, in Libya, as an example, where there is an ongoing conflict between two sides currently. There's actually more factions than that in the country, very complex political situation in Libya. ISIL has exploited that situation to establish a fairly robust and important branch of the organization. In Nigeria, a movement called Boko Haram, which has been around for a number of years, leadership of that organization affiliated with ISIL and received a corresponding request for Boko Haram to join with ISIL. So elements of Boko Haram, which fundamentally is still a Nigerian or West African movement focused on West African issues and northern Nigeria issues in particular, has also affiliated with the Islamic State. They tried to gain adherence in Somalia within the Shabab movement, not particularly successfully. They have adherence in the Arabian Peninsula, in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. They have a branch in Pakistan that has also been under considerable pressure from the Pakistani government. So this is an organization that does have global ambitions. It's not limited to Iraq and Syria. They are pursuing a global reach. And we shouldn't forget that this is an organization that really grew out of Al-Qaeda. It was originally Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then sort of morphed into the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda, of course, has also a global agenda, always has. So ISIL has adopted that and pursued that, but to varying levels of success. And since I mentioned it, it's also important that we not forget that Al-Qaeda as an organization is still present, although the leadership is hunkered down effectively and limited in its ability to communicate in the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region. The organization has also exploited the conflict in Syria. They have a chapter there. It's called Al-Nusra Front. And you've actually seen some senior leaders that historically have been in Pakistan migrate into Syria. They're present there now. The organization is looking at Syria as the base from which to project power into Europe. It's a lot closer, 2,000 miles closer to Europe in the west than Pakistan is. Shabab, that movement I mentioned a minute ago in Somalia, is also an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And there are Al-Qaeda chapters in North Africa and in Southeast Asia and a few other parts of the world. So the organization is weakened, but remains, and we continue to, along with our partners around the world, maintain pressure on Al-Qaeda. There are a number of other organizations that are out there, but Al-Qaeda and ISIL are the two primary sort of with global reach. Then you have a series of organizations that continue to receive support, for instance, from Iran, groups like Hezbollah that are active and have actually used the Syria conflict to, they've sent thousands of fighters, lost more than 1,000 fighters, we believe, in Syria, used that conflict as an opportunity to gain fighting skills, to gain training on advanced weapons systems. So that organization is always a concern for us, given our history with Hezbollah and their continued desire to challenge Israel. But that organization is very much alive and close connection to Iran and the Revolutionary Guard. And the Iranian government is looking to use a number of actors in the region, in particular in Iraq, as agents, as it were, and is building up their capabilities. So those are sort of the principal threats we look at: ISIL, Al-Qaeda, some of the Iran-sponsored groups. And that's not too different than what we've seen in the last couple of years, but it still sort of forms the basis of the threat picture that we see globally. There are a couple trends I did want to point out, though, broad trends I think are important to focus on. The first is that one I mentioned, the foreign terrorist fighters. This is a group of people that, probably have not, many of them are committed absolutely, to a lifetime of terrorism and to inciting insurgency and conflict globally. So we saw in the Afghanistan conflict in the 1980s, people from around the world coalesce in that movement, and then they formed basically the basis of Al-Qaeda over the next several decades. And our intelligence and law enforcement agencies in particular have been chasing after that group ever since. Now we have a new conflict, a whole new generation of people, 40,000 of them from around the world, as I said. Some of them have obviously been killed, some have tried to return home, some have been disillusioned, but there's still a core of these people in that conflict. They are a group that will cause us concern over the coming 15, 20 years, and it's something that governments around the world are attuned to and concerned about, but it's something to think about as a broad trend. The second big trend I would note is another one that you see discussed often in the media, and that is the use of the internet, social media platforms for these groups to communicate, both to communicate operationally, put out propaganda, and also to recruit. So whereas organizations like Al-Qaeda historically operated in clandestine cells where you had to meet somebody, know somebody, be vetted, be brought into the group in a trusting partnership, and then you communicated through couriers, and it was a very complex way to get from one group to another. These organizations are making use of the platform that the internet provides to communicate. They're also using encrypted applications and apps that enable them to communicate in some cases in ways that are not visible to law enforcement agencies. So a lot of concern about the ability of these groups, and these are young people who are quite well very familiar with these new technologies, able to exploit these technologies, which of course are developed for quite other purposes, but to make use of them to advance their terrorist objectives. So that's another broad trend I think we need to think about, and we're going to have to deal with. We are now and continuing in the next number of years. So then the question is, what are we doing about all of this? One thing I wanted to focus on in my remarks, and I hope that I can get this across, is that we in the U.S. government have a very it's a comprehensive approach to confronting terrorism. It's something that involves all agencies, at least the national security and the law enforcement agencies of our government. And if you think about how terrorism is dealt with in the United States, you'll see that the response to an attack is often the local law enforcement, and then in partnership with FBI. And we involve the Department of Homeland Security and our border personnel. And the overseas context, we try to approach this in a comprehensive way and encourage other governments to deal with terrorism threats in a comprehensive fashion, not simply through the efforts of intelligence or military organizations, but more broadly across their societies. So the State Department does have an important role in advancing our counterterrorism objectives. And that means helping to foster the kind of cooperation that we will require from governments in order to advance our objectives. Decisions that get to issues like strengthening border controls or strengthening the authorities of law enforcement to investigate people suspected of terrorism are often political decisions. They are implemented by security agencies, they're implemented by others in the country, but they're political decisions, and we need to work with governments and partners to help build the kind of coalitions and the partnerships that enable us to move forward together. So as an example, and when we think about what we're doing to protect the United States, we really start from the perspective of protecting the homeland and strengthening our security here. So we focus on things like border security and improved aviation security. And that, of course, is important on places like the Canadian or Mexican border, or at the airport in Philadelphia, or in New York or San Francisco. But it also means what's going on at those airports from which these planes originate. What is happening in those countries? Are the aviation security measures up to the par and the requirements that we would want to see? And we therefore work very closely with those governments. We have to. It has to be a partnership. It has to be a common approach. It can't be one and we can use our leverage, and we do when required, but it really is, the idea is to help governments see the threat in a common way. That means sharing with them what we know about the threats in their own country so that they are motivated to take actions that then collectively address and advance our common security objectives. The same would go in border security. When someone arrives at a U.S. port of entry, we want to have cooperated with the country from which they've originated, so that if they're on a watch list in that country, we know about that. And if that's the case, they probably won't get on that plane, quite frankly. But we want to make sure that our information is only good as our information is. And if we don't have that information, it needs to come from our partners. And that's why we work cooperatively across the globe in developing this common approach and these coalitions effectively to address our terrorism threats. So we start with homeland defense, but then we also look at those places from which terrorism emanates. President Obama in 2014 delivered a very important set of remarks. I'd recommend them to all of you. In 2014, he spoke at West Point, where he talked about the importance of building strong partnerships with those countries in which the terrorism threats arise, so that in order for us to move beyond thinking that in all cases it's the responsibility or it is we are alone the only capable response to a terrorism threat, we really need to help our partners build up the capability to identify, to investigate, and to address those threats locally. And so he announced a new initiative. It's called the Counterterrorism Partnership Initiative, and that has then been supported by the Congress. The Congress has allocated new funds, both for the Department of Defense and the State Department, to administer foreign assistance programs to build up the capabilities of partners to better address those threats from where they emanate. So we do that through a number of security assistance programs that range from building focused counterterrorism police capabilities to improved border security measures to improving countries' capability to identify and stop the flow of finance that is helping to fund terrorism activities. We do that through training of prosecutors and judges to handle terrorism cases. We do it in some cases to actually help countries identify what terrorism legislation is necessary in the first place. So going back to that previous example I used with foreign terrorist fighters, many governments we recognized or we found out lacked legislation that would make it a crime to join a terrorist organization outside your own country and to fight for them. Now that would seem to be a rather obvious requirement, but of course we also in this country have history of Americans going off and joining the Abraham Lincoln brigades in Spain. So you have to define that carefully. That has to be, if it's a terrorist organization, in our law, you can be prosecuted for providing material support to a terrorism organization. So we advise other governments on things they might do, steps they might take to strengthen their own legislation, to give their prosecutors the tools to prosecute and address those threats domestically. We take these, we undertake these programs in close coordination with the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, who actually are often the individuals who do the training and who do the interaction with our partners. Diplomacy is also important in building essential coalitions. So in the coalition we have currently over 65 countries to defeat ISIL is a coalition. It's a political coalition. It's a military coalition. They meet frequently. In fact, there's a ministerial in July that will be hosted in Washington, where we'll have representatives of each of those 65 countries to coordinate efforts against ISIL. And that's very important to bring countries together so that they are taking, and we are all taking, coordinated action to address a threat. And as I noted earlier, 2015 was really about the international community responding to the threat. And it worked. It's slow, it's grinding, but it's working, and it's coordinating those efforts. We see that elsewhere. If you think of the conflict in Somalia with Shabab, if you look at who is addressing that conflict, it's the countries, the immediate partners. It's Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Djibouti, Uganda have all contributed forces. And we, the United States, help to train those forces, but prior to their deployments, we enable some of those forces on the ground through intelligence and other equipment to help them engage al-Shabaab and to provide the Somali government with the space it needs to establish itself, really reestablish itself. There hasn't been a federal government in Somalia since the early 1980s, effectively. And it's the governments of that region that have come together in what's called the AMISOM deployment under the African Union to address that threat. The same thing is going on in the West, in West Africa against Boko Haram, a movement that is located in northern Nigeria. It's the countries of the Lake Chad Basin that have come together to contribute forces, to exchange information, intelligence information, and to coordinate military actions against Boko Haram. That's Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and Nigeria principally. And they've developed actually a headquarters in Nouakchott, Chad, in which they have dedicated senior officers, senior intelligence officials to coordinate their efforts. And so you have to have these coalitions to address these terrorist movements. The terrorists will exploit the borders and the sort of false divisions that we erect, in our political system. And so therefore you have to cooperate with other governments to kind of break down those barriers and to ensure that the terrorists aren't able to exploit that. We also use, we don't just work on a bilateral basis, we also use multilateral mechanisms through the United Nations, through other organizations to help build a multilateral basis for addressing terrorism threats. Many governments around the world, I think as you'll know, being members of the World Affairs Council, they may be responsive to requests we, the United States, make of them directly. Some may find it difficult politically in their own systems to take actions simply on the basis of a request from the United States. They might respond, however, if there's a UN mandate. If the UN has identified this as a requirement or an advisable measure, governments can look to that multilateral framework in which to justify decisions. So multilateral diplomacy is very important in the counterterrorism world. Right now in New York, they're debating the renewal of the UN counterterrorism strategy. This is in some ways a rather bland document, but on the other hand, it includes measures that member states are required to take that become very useful as we have our interactions with governments to say, you really need to undertake these changes as the UN has identified. And it's often easier for those governments to take those decisions in their own domestic context on the basis of a UN mandate. A couple years ago, we helped to establish in 2011 a new organization called the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the GCTF. And this is an organization of 29 countries and the EU. And we established this, we were co-chairs of the organization with Turkey for the last several years. Now the co-chairs are the Netherlands and Morocco. We established this organization as a platform for what we call capacity building and developing common good practice in the area of effective counterterrorism policy. So the Global Counterterrorism Forum is an organization of kind of like-minded countries that defines how best to address terrorism threats, addressing a terrorism challenge while at the same time protecting essential civil and human rights. That's a very important thing to define and give examples how governments can do that. It then provides them a basis from which to train within their systems and to align their own practices kind of in a common understanding of how we best should approach this globally. Another example how the UN and multilateral organizations can be helpful, going back again to the example of the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon, in September 2014, the President chaired a session of the UN Security Council, and they emerged with Security Council Resolution 2178. And 2178 identifies steps that governments should take, strengthening legal regimes, prosecuting known facilitators, making it illegal to go to fight for a terrorist organization outside your borders, the kinds of steps we would like to see governments take. And we've used that effectively as a blueprint to push governments to take more effective actions that, as I said, I think have had, and we think, have had an impact upon the flow and the supply of foreign fighters into Iraq and Syria. So as an example, in line with that resolution, 45 countries have passed new or amended existing laws to address the foreign fighter threat. We've also expanded our information sharing with governments on known and suspected terrorists. We have 55 of such agreements on a bilateral basis around the world so that governments can identify individuals who may actually be foreign fighters or have been identified as foreign fighters. So if they pass through a border checkpoint, they can be stopped and investigated. we could talk more about these things in our dialogue, but I do want to turn to another area that we've begun to focus upon quite significantly and robustly in the last couple of years. And this is in the area of counter-radicalization and what's kind of broadly called countering violent extremism. In 2015, and maybe I should set this up by saying that there's been a realization that despite having spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on military efforts, law enforcement efforts, intelligence efforts, all these diplomatic efforts since 9/11, we still have these organizations. They still grow, they still recruit people, you still have young people that are attracted to the ideology. There's something going on there that we need to address in a different way. And so there is a movement really in the counterterrorism community broadly to add effectively tools to the way we address these issues and to get more serious about how to address the root causes, what is driving people toward this. What are the conditions or the situations that are perhaps driving people toward terrorism, and what are the attractive elements of this ideology that we need to counter and work against. So in 2015, the President convened the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism in participation from, I think, 90 different countries. People sent representatives to begin to explore this in a more fundamental way. And after that summit, that was in February of 2015, there was a series of follow-on activities around the world in Algiers, Astana, Nairobi, Nouakchott, Oslo, Singapore, Sydney, and Tirana to begin to build support for a broader agenda to identify what those drivers might be and how we can address them in a common manner. And what really is demonstrated there is that this is not something that we in the United States are only thinking about. There is a lot of interest in this, in understanding in a more detailed way how to address these root causes and the radicalization itself. And so as another example, in the UN system, the Secretary General developed something called the Preventing Violent Extremism Plan of Action. By the way, these documents are all available in the UN for those of you that are really interested in reading through them. That is a document that has about 79 recommendations for governments on addressing the drivers and getting a better understanding and then some of the steps they might take to address them. And that plan of action is part of this debate I was talking about earlier this month in New York to renew the UN counterterrorism strategy. So there is this broader discussion ongoing globally on this issue. And actually last month, we just released, the State Department and USAID, our first joint strategy on countering violent extremism, a document actually that's also available on the State Department website. This strategy has 5 main components. I'll just run through them quickly and then we'll get to the more interesting part of the program. The 5 elements first are investing in understanding of these drivers and research. So we are working with bureaus of the Department of State, the Conflict and Stability Operations Bureau, also the U.S. Institute of Peace, to develop a network of research organizations that are looking into what are called the drivers of radicalization. The first element here is to get a better understanding of the local context. What you find with radicalization is it's very hard to define in a broad sense. There are certain things that are common often, alienation, feeling of certain injustice in an individual. You might have, a repressive government that is driving people toward radicalized ideas. And then there are attractive elements to these ideologies, like a sense of belonging or a sense of adventure. But beyond that, it gets very localized. There might be something happening in a local area, often it's based on family relationships or people falling under the spell or the influence of a particularly charismatic person. And so you really have to localize the research. You can do broad sort of understanding of the drivers, then you have to get down to the local level. So we're looking to increase the research into radicalization, where it's coming from, and directing those resources to those places that are seeing a high incidence of radicalization. As an example, there are parts of, in 2006, there was a very important document stash uncovered in Iraq that basically outlined the foreign fighter flow for Al-Qaeda, elements that were coming into Iraq to fight against our forces that were there. And those documents were very detailed. They demonstrated where people came from around the world. And it was noticed that there were a couple towns, small towns, in Morocco from which a lot of people were coming. So people looked into this. What is the reason there? And there are certain geopolitical and localized reasons why people were coming from a couple towns. It often was that somebody went and then comes back and then starts recruiting others in their area. There's a history of neglect from the government in those areas. Now that government, the Moroccan government, has done a lot in the last 10, 15 years to begin addressing these issues and to look at those places that generated a lot of these recruits. In our country, in the United States, and this is really an issue for Homeland Security or the FBI, there isn't a really discernible pattern to the individuals who try to go off to Syria from the United States. They come from all around the U.S. They don't fit a particular pattern of ethnicity or background, so it's harder to get your handle on. It just demonstrates that there really are often a localized phenomenon. So you need to better understand it. The second one is to work with governments to help them develop more effective practices that will either prevent radicalization or to intervene when radicalization is occurring. And that comes out of just basically developing, common practice and understanding of how to best intervene when radicalization demonstrates itself. The third is to then use our foreign assistance, State Department foreign assistance, USAID foreign assistance, to help governments either develop those capabilities or address some of the underlying causes or drivers that may be leading to radicalization. The fourth objective is to amplify locally credible voices, to counter the narrative of these organizations, and investing in efforts to push back effectively on the narrative and the propaganda that these organizations are putting out. And recently, we in the State Department launched something called the Global Engagement Center, which is committed to just that. And they're working with Silicon Valley, they're working with academics to refine our messages in the United States, but then also in cooperation with partners around the world to more effectively push back against the terrorist narrative. And then finally, the fifth objective is to also look at and encourage programs in the area of reintegration and rehabilitation. So, and then also looking at the prison setting. The prisons are a place where there's a lot of radicalization. We know that. Governments have to do a better job in ensuring that prison populations are separated such that radicalized individuals can't be infecting a broader population. And then also for those individuals who can be brought around, that there be effective off-ramps to the radicalization process. This was brought home recently. There's a case up in Minnesota, I believe, where a judge is basically facing the idea of convicting a 16 or 17-year-old boy who was suspected of being, he tried to go to Syria, and the judge is looking at either a long-term sentence, maybe 20 years, 25 years for a terrorism conviction of a young person who may have frankly just come under the spell or the sway of a charismatic individual. And so the judge is looking at, are there examples of a way to kind of pull this person back before you send them away and incarcerate them for 20 years, as a 17 or 18-year-old. So there are those kinds of things we have to look at as well to bring people back, and then they can often become the most effective spokespersons against radicalization. So I think I'll stop there. And just to give you, again, some sense of the landscape itself, what we're looking at, and then what we as a government are trying to do about it, and some of the things we're beginning to build out, in particular in the counter-radicalization area. So thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Mr. Sieberell, thank you very much. So you mentioned these two broad trends, and I want to focus on the second one, the use of the internet for recruitment and in some cases command and control. After what happened in Orlando, some people were very surprised to find out that ISIS has a radio network. So it's not just communicating via internet, but openly through the radio. And the question is asked, if they're using this for reasons of recruitment and propaganda, Why don't we knock out their capacity to do so? Do we lack the ability, or is there some programmatic reason, some reason of strategy that suggests the juice isn't worth the squeeze and you ought to let them run their radio network and let them do what they do on the internet? So from the State Department's perspective, what's the answer?
Well, I think it's first useful to understand that frankly, the sophistication of an organization like ISIL when it comes to media. You know, we focus a lot on the English language propaganda that they put out. That's accessible to people, and you've probably seen some of it even on news broadcasts. But the vast majority of their communication is in the Arabic language. It is aimed at audiences in that region. They're very strategic in the way that they seek to bring people into the organization. As an example, there's a recruitment video that they put out some time ago that featured individuals clearly from different parts of the world, each identifying a beneficial element in their propaganda to the caliphate itself. And presented in a way that would appeal to young people that are looking to be part of something that's meaningful. You know, they think a lot about how they communicate, and they're very, very good at it. They also, of course, as we know, feature a lot of really, really horrific violence in their video and in their propaganda, and that is shocking and off-putting to people. But for some young people, that is what is attracting them to the organization. So, just to start by saying that they are sophisticated in their communication, and they also communicate across a wide range of media. So it is social media, it is video packets, it's using various boxes to locate media products that are then sent around through a kind of unofficial network of people who continue to broadcast. When it comes to actually the traditional broadcast, you're right, they have had radio. And they do use the radio station in a very traditional way to put out announcements in the way of, kind of a traditional state would, and historically in the Arab world in particular. So those, they also use media kiosks in areas that they control for people to come around and to learn about the organization. Now, a number of those have been identified, and this is a question really for the Department of Defense, and they have actually taken strikes against some of those media platforms, including radio towers and communications towers. Now these guys can get something back up pretty quickly. So it's not, you can't keep these down forever, but you can knock them out or make it more difficult for them to communicate. And they do that. DoD has been doing that in their effort in Iraq and Syria. Now, there's always the question, do you learn more about observing and listening to their communication? And so there is a community, generally speaking, that wants to see, doesn't want to knock out entirely, because you use your observance of their media, in some cases, to learn about the organization. So there's that tension, but generally speaking, the effort has been to knock out their ability to communicate.
Syria is such a focal point in terms of the refugee crisis that is sweeping across Europe, and ISIS has said that they will be using that flood of refugees to send fighters into Europe and to continue to remain relevant. That begs the question, the Russians, how much have they been a help or a hindrance in our overall counterterror efforts? Because the Russians, after all, are a very strong supporter of Assad's, have made clear that he's not going anywhere. And when it comes to fighting in Syria, it appears as if they're fighting Assad's opponents, not against ISIS.
Right. I mean, the Russians themselves have an issue. A lot of Russian citizens from the Caucasus, North Caucasus, areas where the Boston Marathon bombers had family connections. So they have their own issue, and there's a large community of those people in Syria. But it's true. I mean, one of the drivers, frankly, of that conflict and of the radicalization of that conflict has been the Assad regime's unwillingness to engage in a political process to resolve the initial protests against the Syrian government that kind of descended into this this conflict and this what's led to chaos in the country. So to the degree that they prop up the Assad regime and provide disincentives for the regime to negotiate in a genuine manner toward a political solution, that is an unhelpful. But the Russians also are broadly concerned with the same, with some of the radicalization that we are concerned with, and they have also, said that they're taking action against ISIS, but the concern is that they're not contributing to the problem in the most effective way.
We have a firm stop at 1 o'clock, but we do have some time for questions. So, sir, right in the back, and please, in the form of a question, Jeopardy rules.
The big news out of the State Department last week was the 51 State Department officers that used the official back channel to publicly criticize the administration's policy in Syria, which was apparently endorsed by Secretary of State Kerry. Two questions from that. One, if the Secretary of State and the State Department don't agree with U.S. foreign policy, is it really our policy is the result of the unilateral decisions of one office, the president? That's the first question. The second question is, what were the issues that you had with the president's handling of the Syria crisis?
Well, thank you for the question. I don't know that the Secretary has endorsed the view. My understanding is that he said that he had read the message and he looked forward to meeting with those who had written it. This is, and I have not seen the message. This comes in what's called the dissent channel, and the dissent channel is, as has been identified in some of the media reporting, it's a vehicle through which people can register their objection to or concerns with a particular policy. And it's, in my 23-year career, I've heard of it being used and seen it being used. It does actually require a formalized process to be addressed. You don't just send in a dissent channel message and then it kind of goes into the ether. There is a structure through which these are considered. But they are the views of individuals, or in this case, a collection of individuals. And it's not having read it myself, it's hard for me to comment. I wouldn't be able to comment on it anyway. It's not for me to comment upon. There's a process in the department to evaluate these issues. The Secretary has said that he looked forward to reading the message and to meeting with those officers. As to, so I'd leave it right there. I mean, it's a channel through which people can register their concerns about a particular policy.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
But what about the two questions?
Well, the second question was, I think you said, how is it?
Is our foreign policy really the result of one unilateral leader, the president, if the State Department doesn't agree with what he's saying?
No, this is a dissent channel message of some individuals. It's not representative of the department's
It's
policy.
an unprecedented amount of individuals, though. 51.
Sorry?
51 is unprecedented going through that channel.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a department policy, so I can't characterize it in that.
Ma'am?
Yes, I have two questions too. One of my concerns is that terrorism coming in through diseases and, basically a biological threat of coming over the borders, like we saw with some other things, diseases that have already come through from people visiting other countries, or people actually from other countries coming through. Is that something we're addressing? And the other one is, how do you feel about the Syrian refugees coming in here, and is that a threat?
On the first one, it's a real significant concern, the access that groups have to either chemical or biological weapons, or nuclear weapons, of course, and it is a focus, and it will remain a focus of our effort. That's really where you really have to stop and take actions to prevent these groups from gaining access. Now, we assessed that in 2015, ISIL used chemical weapons on a couple of different occasions, and we detailed that in our annual CRT report. So that's a real concern. And groups, the attack a few years ago in Japan on the subway, the group that used, I think, the sarin gas attack that killed many people in the subway. These are groups that in some some factions of which will have no compunction to use biological or chemical weapons. So that has to remain a major focus of our effort, and we're absolutely concerned about it. On the second question, the refugee admissions to the United States, it's really the most rigorous review anyone will undergo to enter the United States as a refugee. I mean, there are, it's over a year-long process of providing information and background checks and checks in the home country to the degree that we can look back. There is, a very robust system in place to ensure that people have gone through, significant vetting before they come to the United States. The refugees, of course, themselves are the victims, in great majority, the victims of terrorism. They're fleeing terrorism. So associating the refugee community with a terrorism threat is really unfortunate. But it's true that ISIL has sought to use the migratory routes into Europe on a couple of occasions. We know that from the Paris attack in particular, to get operatives into Europe. So we have to remain absolutely vigilant and attuned to the threat. But I think our systems to vet individuals in the refugee program are extremely robust, and I have full confidence that they could keep us safe.
Ma'am, straight ahead.
You were talking about the trends from 2014 and 15, but we're 6 months into 2016, and I was watching John Brennan last week live, not like little snippets in the nightly newscast, and he was very clear. I mean, he couldn't have been more blunt, saying that ISIS is expanding. If we're not stalled, we're going backwards. It's expanding, and I saw a report today that they now have regional armies in at least 6 countries in that area. So my question to you is, how can John Brennan be saying one thing, and you're saying that the trends are that ISIS is losing money, losing ground, and we're on the upswing? I mean, he was very, very clear.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with the CIA director on the assessment. But I will stand by the fact that they lost territory in Iraq and in Syria in 2015. It's there to see. And he would say the same thing. It's there. And I did say that they have identified and affiliated with movements outside of Iraq and Syria, and that is a concern. And that is a trend that also appeared through 2015 and is of concern. Noted that they are present in Libya. They've come under some pressure, in CERT in particular, from the Misratans to the west. They are present in Nigeria insofar as they have affiliated with Boko Haram. They have made inroads in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia. I noted all of those things. And in Pakistan. But in every one of those places, they're also under some pressure. So I'm not sure. I would agree, absolutely, and I think I said so, that this is an organization that does have global ambitions and that is trying to expand. And maybe most worryingly, quite frankly, there was a message put out by their spokesperson, Al-Adnani, in May, in which he acknowledged that the group is coming under pressure in Iraq and Syria, losing senior leaders, having difficulty getting individuals, foreign elements to come into the area. But he then made an appeal for people to attack in their home and where they are. He said, "You're there, we're not. If we had access to the West like you do, then we would be conducting those attacks, but we don't, and you do. So conduct attacks in your home countries." This is a very worrisome thing. The idea of individuals being radicalized and inspired to violence from the message they put out. So yes, I would agree that armies and the collections and the concentration of forces are of real concern, in particular those places where they can exploit political turmoil or chaos, like in Libya or Yemen, where you really have had a collapse of government, for Somalia. And they and other terrorist groups will always exploit those opportunities where you have a failure of governance and then therefore space created for an organization. But it's this inspiration of lone wolf actors, which I think is frankly, one of the real concerns, particularly for us here in the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, the time has come. Mr. Sieberell does have another appointment. We have a 1 o'clock firm stop. Please, let's thank Mr. Sieberell for coming. Thank you also for your service to our nation. And We wish you all a very good day. Look forward to seeing you the next time the World Affairs Council comes together. Thank you.